While international attention is fixed on space exploration and rare earth mines on land, a much larger, multi-trillion-dollar corporate race is quietly unfolding 2 miles beneath the ocean surface. In the pitch-black abyss of international waters, elite private consortiums, defense giants, and sovereign wealth funds are positioning heavy machinery to claim the ocean floor. They aren't exploring for science. They are targeting the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a vast underwater desert rich in trillions of dollars worth of battery metals. The system is locked in a frantic legal scramble as a select group of powerful players rushes to secure exploratory rights before global maritime regulations freeze them out forever. For 1,000 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, there is no light, no plant life, and almost no sound beyond the hum of hydraulic machinery. It is a place humans were never meant to visit, and yet it has become one of the most fiercely contested pieces of real estate on the planet. What lies down there is not oil, not gold, and not diamonds. It is something far more mundane in appearance and far more valuable in consequence. Small, dark, potato-sized rocks scattered across the seafloor by the trillions, each one containing the exact combination of metals the modern world cannot function without. These rocks are called polymetallic nodules, and they represent one of the strangest natural phenomena on Earth. They form around a tiny nucleus, often a shark tooth or a fragment of bone, as dissolved metals in seawater slowly precipitate and accumulate in concentric layers, similar to how a pearl forms inside an oyster. The process is almost unimaginably slow. A single nodule can take between 1 and 10 million years to grow just a few centimeters. Nature has been quietly manufacturing this resource since long before humans existed, undisturbed, in total darkness, at pressures that would crush a submarine. Inside each nodule is a concentrated blend of manganese, nickel, cobalt, and copper for metals that form the literal backbone of the global electric vehicle and renewable energy supply chain. Nickel and cobalt are essential to lithium-ion battery cathodes. Copper is required for virtually every wire in an electric drivetrain. Manganese stabilizes battery chemistry and extends charge cycles. In other words, the transition away from fossil fuels, the single largest industrial shift of the 21st century, depends on exactly the elements sitting in these nodules. What makes the abyssal plain so attractive to industry is not just the presence of these metals, but their concentration compared to land-based mining. A single nodule field can contain higher grades of nickel and cobalt than most terrestrial mines, without the need to blast through kilometers of rock, relocate communities, or negotiate with dozens of competing landowners. In theory, a robotic harvester can simply glide across the seafloor and collect the nodules like gathering stones from a beach. In practice, that beach sits under nearly 400 atmospheres of pressure in complete darkness, thousands of kilometers from the nearest port. The scale of what is at stake is difficult to overstate. Estimates place the total value of extractable metals in the world's most promising nodule fields at several $trillion, a figure that rivals the annual economic output of entire industrialized nations. It is a resource base large enough to reshape global supply chains, shift the balance of power between mining nations and manufacturing nations, and determine who controls the raw materials behind the next century of technology. To understand why this race is happening now, you have to look at a specific stretch of open ocean between Hawaii and Mexico known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It spans roughly 4.5 million square kilometers, an area larger than the entire European Union, sitting entirely in international waters. No single nation owns it. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the seabed beyond national jurisdiction is legally designated as the common heritage of mankind, meant to be managed for the benefit of humanity as a whole rather than any one country or company. That legal framework sounds noble, but it created an unusual structure in practice. Because private corporations cannot directly apply for mining rights in international waters, they need a sponsoring state, a national government willing to submit an exploration application on their behalf to the International Seabed Authority. This has produced a pattern that critics describe as flag of convenience mining. Small island nations with limited industrial capacity of their own, states such as Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati, have become the official sponsors for deep-sea mining ventures that are, in reality, backed by large multinational metals and engineering firms based in wealthier nations. The arrangement benefits both sides. The island nation receives a share of future royalties and diplomatic relevance it would not otherwise have on the world stage. The corporation gains a legal gateway into a resource zone it could never access on its own, while distancing itself from direct accountability under its home country's stricter environmental or labor regulations. It is, in effect, a form of legal outsourcing where sovereignty is rented rather than owned outright. This structure has triggered quiet friction inside the International Seabed Authority itself. Larger industrial nations, including several in Europe, along with a coalition of Pacific Island states worried about ecological fallout in their own waters, have pushed back against what they see as a system easily exploited by well-funded interests hiding behind smaller flags. Meanwhile, a handful of powerful sponsoring arrangements have already secured multi-year exploration contracts covering enormous sections of the Clarion-Clipperton seabed, effectively reserving the richest nodule fields before the rules for actual commercial extraction have even been finalized. That timing is not accidental. Under the law of the sea framework, holding an exploration contract creates a strong presumptional advantage toward eventually receiving an exploitation license once mining is formally permitted. In other words, the companies and nations that move first, that file the paperwork earliest and stake their claims across the widest possible seabed area, are positioning themselves to inherit the most valuable ground the moment mining is legally authorized. This is why the current period, before global rules are locked in, has turned into such an intense and quiet scramble among sovereign proxies and the corporate interests standing behind them. Claiming a stretch of seafloor is one challenge. Actually operating machinery down there is an entirely different order of difficulty, one that pushes modern robotics and material science to their absolute limits. At 4,000 meters, the water pressure exceeds 5,000 pounds per square inch, enough to implode a poorly sealed piece of equipment instantly. There is no sunlight. Temperatures hover just above freezing, and any machine sent down must operate for weeks or months without a single human hand nearby to fix it. The core piece of equipment in most commercial designs is a massive tracked or wheel collector vehicle, some weighing well over 20 tons, engineered to crawl slowly across the seabed like an enormous vacuum cleaner. Rotating heads or hydraulic jets disturb the top layer of sediment just enough to loosen the nodules without burying the machine itself. The nodules are then drawn up through an intake system, separated from mud and water, and funneled into a riser pipe that can stretch the full 4 kilometers back up to a surface support vessel. That riser pipe is itself a feat of engineering few people ever think about. It has to withstand its own weight across kilometers of vertical span, resist twisting from ocean currents at multiple depth layers simultaneously, and reliably transport a slurry of rock, mud, and seawater upward without clogging or rupturing. Engineers describe it as similar to trying to vacuum gravel through a garden hose long enough to stretch across a mountain range, while the far end is being tugged in different directions by invisible currents the whole time. Every part of this operation is remote-controlled, guided from the surface vessel through a tether that carries both power and data. Operators watch live sonar and camera feeds from a control room that looks more like something from an airline cockpit than a traditional mining operation, adjusting collector speed and heading in real time as it navigates terrain that has never been mapped in detail. A single mechanical failure at that depth is not a simple repair job. It can mean weeks of delay while a specialized recovery vessel is dispatched, at a cost that can run into the millions of dollars for a single incident. Because of this complexity, only a small number of companies in the world currently possess the technical capability and capital to build and operate this equipment. Deep-sea engineering firms, often spun out of oil and gas exploration technology, defense contractors with underwater vehicle experience, and a handful of specialized mining conglomerates dominate this space. That scarcity of technical capability is itself a form of gatekeeping. Even if the legal rules open tomorrow to allow full commercial extraction, the vast majority of nations and companies on Earth simply do not have the engineering base required to compete, leaving the field open to an extremely narrow circle of players. That legal framework sounds noble, but it created an unusual structure in practice. Because private corporations cannot directly apply for mining rights in international waters, they need a sponsoring state, a national government willing to submit an exploration application on their behalf to the International Seabed Authority. This has produced a pattern that critics describe as flag of convenience mining. Small island nations with limited industrial capacity of their own States such as Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati have become the official sponsors for deep-sea mining ventures that are in reality backed by large multinational metals and engineering firms based in wealthier nations. The arrangement benefits both sides. The island nation receives a share of future royalties and diplomatic relevance it would not otherwise have on the world stage. The corporation gains a legal gateway into a resource zone it could never access on its own, while distancing itself from direct accountability under its home country's stricter environmental or labor regulations. It is, in effect, a form of legal outsourcing where sovereignty is rented rather than owned outright. This structure has triggered quiet friction inside the International Seabed Authority itself. Larger industrial nations, including several in Europe, along with a coalition of Pacific Island states worried about ecological fallout in their own waters, have pushed back against what they see as a system easily exploited by well-funded interests hiding behind smaller flags. Meanwhile, a handful of powerful sponsoring arrangements have already secured multi-year exploration contracts covering enormous sections of the Clarion-Clipperton seabed, effectively reserving the richest nodule fields before the rules for actual commercial extraction have even been finalized. That timing is not accidental. Under the law of the sea framework, holding an exploration contract creates a strong presumptional advantage toward eventually receiving an exploitation license once mining is formally permitted. In other words, the companies and nations that move first, that file the paperwork earliest and stake their claims across the widest possible seabed area, are positioning themselves to inherit the most valuable ground the moment mining is legally authorized. This is why the current period, before global rules are locked in, has turned into such an intense and quiet scramble among sovereign proxies and the corporate interests standing behind them. Behind the scenes of this technical race sits a quieter, slower-moving institutional battle, one being fought inside conference rooms in Kingston, Jamaica, where the International Seabed Authority is headquartered. The ISA was established under the Law of the Sea Treaty with a specific mandate to regulate mineral activities in international waters and ensure that the benefits are shared broadly rather than captured by whoever gets there first. For years, that mandate existed mostly on paper, because commercial-scale nodule mining was not yet technically feasible. That changed once mining technology matured, and metal demand from the electric vehicle boom accelerated. Suddenly, finalizing a mining code, the detailed legal framework that would govern how commercial exploitation actually happens, environmental protections, royalty structures, and liability rules, became urgent. And urgency created leverage. In 2021, the tiny Pacific nation of Nauru invoked a rarely used treaty provision, giving the ISA a 2-year deadline to complete the mining code or risk having applications considered under whatever rules existed at the time, finished or not. That single procedural move triggered a wave of anxiety and lobbying across the international community. Environmental coalitions and several national governments pushed for a precautionary pause, arguing that mining should not begin until scientists better understand the ecological consequences. At the same time, corporate-backed sponsoring states and mining companies pushed just as hard in the opposite direction, arguing that indefinite delays simply hand strategic advantage in the battery metals race to whichever nations are willing to move first outside the multilateral system altogether. The negotiations themselves have been described by several participants as unusually opaque even by the standards of international diplomacy. Delegates from smaller nations, often without dedicated legal or scientific staff to review highly technical proposals, have reported feeling outmatched by teams of experienced corporate lobbyists and consultants attending sessions on behalf of sponsoring states. Draft regulations covering financial payment structures, environmental thresholds, and liability limits have shifted repeatedly, often shaped by input from the same handful of well-resourced entities with the clearest stake in the outcome. What emerges from this process will not be a minor bureaucratic footnote. It will effectively determine how trillions of dollars of seabed resources are divided, who bears the environmental risk, and how much of the profit flows back to the international community that technically owns a resource, versus how much stays with the small circle corporations and sponsoring states positioned to extract it first. Beneath every economic projection and every legal negotiation sits a much darker and less resolved question. What actually happens to the deep ocean once large-scale extraction begins? The abyssal plains of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone are not the barren underwater desert they might appear to be from a satellite image. They host an extraordinary and largely undocumented diversity of life. Sponges, sea cucumbers, tiny crustaceans, and countless species that scientists believe exist nowhere else on the planet, many of them still unnamed and unclassified in any scientific database. The mining process itself creates two distinct forms of environmental disruption. The first happens directly at the seafloor, where collector vehicles physically strip away the top layer of sediment along with the nodules themselves. Because those nodules serve as the only hard surface many deep-sea organisms can attach to, removing them essentially erases the physical habitat those species depend on, not temporarily, but for a length of time measured in millions of years, given how slowly the nodules originally formed. The second and arguably more far-reaching disruption comes from sediment plumes. As collector vehicles disturb the seabed, they stir up fine clouds of mud and displace material that can drift for kilometers on deep ocean currents, far beyond the immediate mining site. These plumes can smother filter-feeding organisms, cloud the water in ways that disrupt bioluminescent communication used by deep-sea species, and settle onto seafloor habitats well outside any officially permitted mining zone. Because deep ocean currents are still poorly mapped in many regions, predicting exactly how far and how long these plumes will travel remains a significant scientific uncertainty. There is also a growing body of research raising concerns about the water column above the seafloor itself, not just the bottom. Some proposed mining designs involve discharging waste slurry at mid-ocean depths after nodules are processed on the surface vessel, introducing sediment and dissolved metals into layers of the ocean that host migratory fish populations and other marine life entirely separate from the seafloor ecosystem. Marine scientists have warned that the cumulative, long-term effect of industrial-scale mining across an area the size of a small continent remain almost entirely untested in any real-world setting. This scientific uncertainty is precisely what has fueled calls from several governments, ocean conservation groups, and even some seafood and technology companies for a moratorium, a pause on commercial mining, until independent research can establish clearer environmental baselines. Yet that same uncertainty is also being used by mining proponents to argue the opposite, that without full-scale operations, the data needed to properly assess the risk can never actually be gathered. The result is a standoff where the ocean floor itself sits at the center of the argument, and no consensus has emerged from either side. Step back from the ocean floor and the environmental debate for a moment, and a much larger economic pattern comes into focus. Whoever secures reliable, large-scale access to these nodule fields gains something far more valuable than the raw metal itself: leverage over the entire downstream battery and electric vehicle supply chain. For over a decade, that leverage over cobalt and nickel has been concentrated on land, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which supplies the majority of the world's cobalt, and in Indonesia, which dominates global nickel production. Both of those land-based supply chains come with serious vulnerabilities that manufacturers have spent years trying to work around, including politically unstable mining regions, well-documented labor and human rights concerns, and processing industries increasingly consolidated under a small number of state-linked companies. Deep-sea nodules offer something these land-based sources cannot: a supply chain that bypasses existing geopolitical choke points entirely, controlled instead by whichever handful of consortiums hold exploration and eventually exploitation rights in international waters. This is precisely why the current positioning around the Clarion-Clipperton Zone matters so much to major automakers and battery manufacturers, even though most of them are not directly involved in the mining operations themselves. Several large technology and automotive companies have already signed conditional supply agreements or made early investments tied to future seabed mineral output, essentially reserving a stake in a resource that does not yet legally exist as a commercial product. It is a bet that whoever locks in early access now will have significant pricing power once the mining code is finalized and extraction scales up. If that scenario plays out, a very small number of corporate syndicates, those with both the sponsoring state relationships and the deep-sea engineering capability, could end up controlling a meaningful share of the world's future nickel and cobalt supply outside of any single nation's regulatory reach. That is a fundamentally different kind of market power than has existed in land-based mining, where at least multiple competing countries and companies operate under their own separate domestic laws. A concentrated seabed mining sector, by contrast, would answer primarily to the terms negotiated within the International Seabed Authority itself. Terms that, as we've seen, are being shaped heavily by the same players positioned to benefit from them. The long-term implication is a potential restructuring of how EV battery prices are set globally. Instead of prices fluctuating based on competition among many mining nations and companies, a concentrated seabed supply could allow a small circle of players to influence global battery metal pricing far more directly, with cascading effects on the affordability of electric vehicles and renewable energy storage for consumers everywhere. Step far enough back from the legal filings, the engineering diagrams, and the environmental studies, and what remains is a much larger and more uncomfortable question. The deep ocean floor is one of the last truly unclaimed spaces on Earth, a place that, until recently, existed almost entirely outside the reach of national borders, corporate title, or private property. What is happening in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone right now may represent the opening chapter of that changing permanently. The mechanisms driving this shift are not dramatic or sudden. There is no single moment of conquest, no flag planted on the seafloor. Instead, it is happening through exploration contracts, sponsoring state arrangements and technical committee negotiations, a slow, procedural, almost bureaucratic process that nonetheless carries enormous consequences. By the time the mining code is finalized and commercial extraction formally begins, the most valuable sections of seabed may already be locked into long-term rights held by a small number of consortiums, decided years in advance through a process most of the world never closely watched. What makes this moment particularly significant is the precedent it sets. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone is only one region among several similarly rich nodule fields identified around the world's oceans. If the legal and commercial model established here proves profitable, it becomes a template that can be extended to other stretches of international seabed, each one following a similar pattern of sponsoring states, exploration contracts, and specialized engineering consortiums claiming ground before public awareness or regulatory oversight has fully caught up. There is still time for that trajectory to shift. The mining code remains unfinished, environmental research continues, and public attention on this issue, however limited so far, has already influenced several governments to adopt more cautious positions. But the underlying economic pressure driving this race, the demand for battery metals, the value of bypassing land-based supply chains, and the strategic advantage of moving first, shows no sign of easing. Whether the deep ocean ends up managed as a shared resource for humanity, as the original treaty language envisioned, or effectively divided among a small circle of powerful private and sovereign interests, will be decided largely out of public view in the coming decisions of the very consortiums and negotiators shaping this story right now.